The truth is brutal, and sometimes it cuts deeper than any wound. They never wanted to destroy you all at once. That would have been too obvious, too easy to recognize. What they really wanted was something much colder, to tear you down piece by piece in front of others until your confidence disappeared beneath the weight of shame. They wanted you hurting in silence while they smiled as if nothing had happened. And let's be honest, you survived what many people would have struggled to endure. What you faced wasn't simply random drama or another difficult chapter. It felt calculated, staged and designed to make you question yourself while everyone watched. Public humiliation has always been used by toxic people and controlling environments as a weapon. Why? Because shame doesn't disappear when the moment ends. It can linger, making you carry guilt for something that was never yours to carry. They made it look like concern. They called it discipline. They acted as if they were teaching you a lesson. But beneath the surface, they wanted you to question your own worth. They wanted you apologizing for the wounds they caused. And here's the part they never expected. You refused to give them the collapse they were waiting for. You didn't lose yourself. You didn't chase their approval. You didn't need to expose everyone around you. Instead, you observed, you became aware. And that awareness protected you. Because discernment is dangerous to manipulation. It's that quiet inner signal that tells you something isn't right. It's the feeling that makes you step back before walking into a trap. While they assumed you were confused, you were paying attention. While they were planning their next move, you were noticing the patterns. That's why you're still standing today. Chosen one, if this message speaks to something you've experienced, pause for a moment and support the channel with a like and subscribe. Every share helps this message reach someone who may need the same reminder. Thank you for being here. Now let's go deeper. The silence that comes after surviving something painful isn't empty. It carries a different kind of strength. It's like the calm after a storm. The air feels clearer. The sky looks different, and the ground still remembers what happened. That's where you are now. The people who expected you to disappear are surprised by your silence, because your silence means their expectations didn't come true. They see you moving forward, not destroyed, but wiser. Every step you take reminds them that what was meant to break you didn't finish the job. If your life were a series, that chapter would have looked like the ending. Everyone was waiting for you to fall, waiting for your story to lose momentum. But you turned the page. You came back with a different mindset, stronger boundaries, and a story they can no longer control. That's why your transformation makes them uncomfortable. What was supposed to end in defeat became the beginning of your awakening. Look at the pattern throughout history. People who use shame and manipulation to control others eventually become trapped by their own deception. Lies can create an image for a while, but truth has a way of revealing what was hidden. The very experience that once made you feel powerless has now given you awareness. This isn't only about surviving, it's about understanding. You now recognize the patterns. You understand why your clarity made certain people uncomfortable. You understand why your silence wasn't weakness, it was restraint. They underestimated your patience. They underestimated your ability to endure without losing yourself. They thought the pressure would turn you into ashes. Instead, it refined you. The story they tried to create around you no longer belongs to them. You are holding the pen now. No insult, No humiliation, no false narrative gets to decide how your story ends. The final word belongs to your resilience, your wisdom, your discernment, and the quiet strength that kept you standing when others expected you to bow. Listen closely, chosen one, because this isn't simply another story you found online. Consider it a reminder of what you've already survived. You walked through moments designed to make you feel small, yet you're still here, still learning, still growing, and still moving forward. That alone says more about your strength than their opinions ever could. So if you believe discernment helped you recognize what wasn't right, drop 777 in the comments. Let it represent awareness, strength, and the decision to stop ignoring what your spirit was telling you. And if this message is speaking directly to your heart, don't just listen and move on. Like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Because now we're going to break this down step by step, and the deeper you go, the more you'll understand why what happened to you didn't get the final word. Let's begin. Number 1. They tried to pull you down because your light revealed what they wanted hidden. They didn't come after you because they saw you as powerless. They came after you because something about you made certain things impossible to hide. Your presence revealed what they preferred to keep buried. Let's be honest about what happened. Their goal wasn't simply to make you feel small. They wanted to control the way others perceived you. They knew that if they could damage your image, spread enough doubt, and make your character questionable, people might stop looking closely at their own behavior. You walked into environments where manipulation was normal, where people smiled while carrying hidden intentions, and where loyalty often disappeared the moment it became inconvenient. But you refused to become part of that pattern. Your honesty made the game uncomfortable for people who depended on deception. So instead of confronting the truth, they redirected attention toward you. They questioned your character. They exaggerated your mistakes. They turned ordinary moments into evidence against you. Why? Because attacking someone's reputation is easier than explaining your own behavior. They weren't necessarily trying to remove you from the room. They wanted you to lose confidence while staying there. They wanted you constantly wondering whether your instincts were wrong. And maybe for a while their strategy worked. Maybe there were nights when you replayed conversations in your head and asked yourself, did I misunderstand everything? Was I too emotional? Did I somehow cause this? That's how manipulation becomes powerful. It doesn't always arrive as an obvious attack. Sometimes it enters through uncertainty. It makes you question your memory, your judgment, and eventually your own identity. But something inside you refused to stay confused forever. You began noticing patterns. You remembered conversations differently. You started connecting moments that once seemed unrelated. The strange comments, the sudden changes in behavior, the compliments that carried hidden insults. The people who supported you publicly but disappeared when you actually needed them. Your pain didn't destroy your awareness, it sharpened it. That's the part they didn't anticipate. They assumed suffering would make you easier to control. Instead, it taught you how to observe. You stopped listening only to what people said and started paying attention to what they consistently did. You learned that behavior tells a story words can never completely hide. And eventually, you understood something powerful. Their campaign against you was never a reliable description of who you were. It was a window into what they were willing to do when they felt threatened. People who are secure in themselves rarely need to destroy someone else's reputation to feel important. Think of a bright light entering a room that has been dark for years. The light doesn't create the mess, it simply makes the mess visible. That's what your growth did. You didn't create every uncomfortable truth around you. You simply became difficult to fool once you started seeing clearly. They wanted everyone focused on your imperfections, so nobody would examine their contradictions. They wanted the conversation to be about your reaction instead of what caused it. They wanted your response to become the headline while their behavior disappeared into the background. But you didn't give them everything they wanted. You learned when to speak and when to remain silent. You discovered that responding to every accusation can trap you inside someone else's narrative. Sometimes walking away isn't surrender. Sometimes it's refusing to participate in a conversation designed to drain you. People may have wondered why you didn't defend yourself more aggressively. Why didn't you expose every detail? Why didn't you answer every rumor? Why didn't you fight back publicly? Because eventually you realized something. Not every battle deserves your energy. Your restraint gave time enough room to reveal what arguments never could. People began noticing inconsistencies for themselves. Stories stopped matching reality. Certain behaviors became impossible to explain. You didn't need to force the truth into the open. Time had a way of doing that for you, and now look at what happened. The experience that was supposed to damage your confidence became part of your strength. The situation intended to embarrass you taught you boundaries. The betrayal taught you awareness. The disappointment taught you discernment. The pressure taught you emotional control. You are not the same person who walked into that situation. You now recognize patterns much earlier. You notice when someone's words and actions don't align. You can sense when kindness is being used as a disguise for control. You understand that not every invitation is an opportunity, and not every friendly face deserves access to your life. That's what makes your next chapter different. You aren't walking forward completely unaware anymore. You carry experience with you. You carry lessons. You carry a stronger understanding of yourself. So if you've ever wondered why certain people work so hard to bring you down, maybe the answer isn't that you were weak. Maybe your refusal to become like them made you difficult to control. Maybe they weren't reacting to your weakness at all. Maybe they were reacting to the fact that you were becoming harder to manipulate, and now you have something they can't easily take away: awareness. You survived the confusion, learned from the experience, and came out with clearer boundaries. You don't need revenge. You don't need to prove yourself to everyone. You simply need to keep moving with wisdom. Because once you've learned how manipulation feels, you become far less willing to ignore the warning signs. Once you've experienced betrayal, you become more intentional about who receives your trust. Once you've walked through public criticism and survived it, someone else's opinion no longer has the same power over you. You didn't become cold. You became discerning. You didn't lose your heart. You learned where to place it. And you didn't become distant because you stopped caring. You became selective because you finally understood your value. Number 2, what looked like rejection was actually a revelation. Rejection can feel like a verdict on your worth, but sometimes it is simply information arriving in a painful form. A friendship ends, someone stops calling, a door closes, a group suddenly treats you differently. In the moment, it can feel like you've been discarded. But later, you may realize that the separation revealed something you couldn't see while you were emotionally attached. Not every person who leaves your life is taking something valuable with them. Sometimes their departure creates room for you to breathe again. Think about the relationships you once fought to preserve. Maybe you kept making excuses for certain behaviors because you remembered the good moments. Maybe you tolerated disrespect because you didn't want to lose the connection. Maybe you kept hoping someone would eventually become the person you believed they could be. Then something happened that made the truth impossible to ignore. The distance became obvious. The mask slipped. The relationship changed. And although it hurt, you finally saw what you had been trying not to see. That is why some endings feel strangely painful and freeing at the same time. You're grieving the relationship you thought you had while simultaneously discovering the relationship you actually had. Sometimes a closed door is not punishment. Sometimes it prevents you from carrying the wrong people into the next season of your life. Imagine carrying an overloaded suitcase everywhere you go. You've become so accustomed to its weight that you no longer question it. Then one day, the suitcase breaks open and everything spills onto the floor. At first, you're embarrassed and frustrated. But as you begin sorting through everything, you realize how much of it you never needed. That's what certain endings can do. They force you to examine what you've been carrying. Old expectations, one-sided friendships, fear of being alone, the need for approval, the habit of explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. What felt like loss may have actually been the beginning of release. You may have thought you were losing people, but in some cases you were losing patterns. You were losing attachments that kept you stuck. You were losing the version of yourself that believed you had to tolerate everything just to keep people around. And that realization changes everything. You stop begging people to understand you. You stop chasing conversations that have already ended. You stop forcing yourself into spaces where you constantly have to prove that you belong. You begin choosing peace over performance. The rejection still may have hurt. The disappointment was still real, but pain doesn't automatically mean something was meant to remain in your life. Sometimes pain is simply the price of finally seeing clearly. And when you understand that, you stop asking, "Why wasn't I enough for them?" You start asking a much stronger question. Why was I trying so hard to remain where I was never truly valued? That question can change the direction of your entire life. You didn't simply lose people or opportunities. You discovered what was quietly pulling you away from your purpose. Some doors looked promising from a distance, but behind them were distractions you didn't yet recognize. What you gained through those painful endings was something far more valuable: awareness. You learned to notice when a smile didn't match someone's intentions. You learned that a gentle voice can still carry manipulation. You learned to pay attention when your inner sense told you something wasn't right, instead of constantly demanding proof before trusting yourself. That wisdom came with a price. But now that you've earned it, nobody can easily take it away from you. And maybe you've wondered, if all of this was helping me grow, why did it feel so cruel? Why did it feel like I was being punished while everyone else seemed to move forward? Because transformation rarely feels comfortable while you're inside it. When something familiar is being removed from your life, it can feel like everything is falling apart. You don't immediately see the purpose, you only feel the loss. Think about a forest after a powerful storm. Branches fall. Old trees are damaged. Everything looks chaotic for a while. Yet the storm also clears what was weak, dead, or already beginning to decay. What looks destructive from one perspective can create space for something healthier to grow. Your experience may have felt like that. It wasn't pleasant, but it forced you to examine what you had been accepting. Imagine wearing glasses that have been slightly cracked for years. You adapt to the distortion because you've never known anything else. Then one day, you replace the lenses and suddenly realize how much you've been missing. The new vision can feel overwhelming at first because reality looks completely different. That's what clarity can feel like after a painful awakening. Suddenly, certain conversations make sense, certain relationships make sense, certain betrayals make sense. You begin understanding why your spirit kept warning you long before your mind was ready to accept the truth. You weren't simply being pushed away. You were being redirected toward a life where you wouldn't have to constantly shrink yourself to maintain belonging. And if you're honest, you probably noticed the signs. You saw how quickly certain people changed when you stopped cooperating with their expectations. You noticed who became distant when you established boundaries. You noticed who seemed strangely entertained by your difficult moments. You noticed who only supported you when your success didn't make them uncomfortable. Those moments revealed more than years of friendly conversation ever could. Think about turning on a flashlight in a room that has been dark for years. The flashlight doesn't create the dirt, the cracks, or the clutter. It simply makes them visible. That's what your awareness did. Once you started looking closely, things that had been hidden became impossible to ignore, and that changed your relationships. What once felt like loneliness became space. What once felt like abandonment became separation from what was unhealthy. What once felt like rejection became information. You weren't being stripped of everything valuable. You were learning the difference between what was genuine and what only looked genuine. Because the next chapter of your life requires a different level of discernment. You cannot carry every old attachment into every new season. Some things had to end simply because they could not continue with the person you were becoming. So the next time a door closes, don't immediately assume that you've been forgotten. Pause. Ask yourself, what is this moment showing me that I couldn't see before? That's where clarity begins. You stop chasing acceptance from people who constantly make you question your worth. You stop forcing conversations that repeatedly leave you drained. You stop trying to convince people to recognize something they have already decided not to see. You become more careful about where you invest your energy. So no, your story isn't simply about being rejected. It's about becoming more selective. It's about learning what deserves access to you and what doesn't. The experience that once made you feel isolated may have been the very thing that taught you how to protect your peace. And now you carry something different. You don't walk into every room assuming everyone has good intentions. You don't become paranoid either. You simply pay attention. You observe consistency. You watch actions. You trust patterns more than promises. That's growth. Number 3, they didn't need you destroyed. They needed you to stop questioning their influence. This part goes deeper. Sometimes control doesn't look like an obvious threat. Sometimes it looks like slowly convincing someone that their own judgment cannot be trusted. They didn't necessarily need you removed from their world. They benefited more if you stayed, but stayed uncertain, quiet, and disconnected from your own confidence. Because a person who trusts themselves is difficult to manipulate. A person who knows their boundaries is difficult to pressure. And someone who recognizes unhealthy patterns is difficult to keep trapped inside them. So the strategy can become subtle. A joke that makes you feel small. A compliment followed by criticism. Advice that sounds caring but constantly undermines your confidence. A friend who says they support you while repeatedly discouraging every step you take. None of these moments may seem significant by themselves, but repeated often enough, they can slowly change the way someone sees themselves. Imagine a person standing in front of a locked door, even though the door isn't actually locked. They've simply been told for so long that they aren't allowed to leave that eventually they stop trying. That's what psychological control can look like. The cage doesn't always need physical bars. Sometimes the bars are made from fear, guilt, shame, and self-doubt. They wanted you to believe that speaking confidently made you arrogant, that setting boundaries made you selfish, that walking away made you disloyal, that trusting your instincts made you difficult. If you believed those messages long enough, you might begin limiting yourself without anyone having to command you. You might stop pursuing opportunities, stop expressing your ideas, stop entering new spaces, stop taking chances, stop believing you deserve better. And that's exactly why your awakening mattered. At some point, something inside you said, "Wait, this doesn't feel right." You started listening to that feeling. You noticed how conversations changed depending on who was present. You recognized the difference between genuine encouragement and subtle discouragement. You began separating advice from control and concern from criticism disguised as concern. And instead of creating chaos, you became quieter. You stepped back. You observed. You protected your energy. That response may have surprised people who expected you to keep explaining yourself, because they were familiar with the version of you that constantly questioned yourself. They weren't prepared for the version of you that could calmly say, "This no longer works for me." You didn't need to announce your transformation. Your decisions started speaking for you. Now you're moving differently. You're not looking for permission to become who you're supposed to become. You're not waiting for everyone to understand your choices before you make them. You're learning that peace doesn't require unanimous approval. And that's what makes the cage disappear. The moment you stop believing that someone else's opinion determines your value, their control over you begins to weaken. The moment you trust your judgment again, the old patterns lose their power. You are still here. You are still moving. And most importantly, you're becoming aware of the difference between being guided and being controlled. Once you recognize that difference, you become much harder to manipulate. They may have expected you to remain quiet forever. Instead, you became conscious of your own voice. They may have expected you to stay small. Instead, you started taking up the space you had always been afraid to claim. And that is the part they never planned for. You woke up. Once you wake up to your own worth, you may still face challenges, but you no longer have to live inside someone else's definition of who you are. Number 4. The moment they tried to shame you, they accidentally revealed what was happening behind the scenes. The attempt to embarrass you publicly didn't only affect your reputation, it also made certain hidden dynamics much easier to recognize. People who had remained quiet suddenly became curious. Conversations changed. Certain faces looked different. You started noticing how quickly information traveled and how many people seemed to know things you had never personally told them. At first, you probably wondered what was happening. Why did so many people suddenly seem interested in your situation? Why were people who had barely spoken to you suddenly forming opinions about you? Then you started paying attention. You realized that some environments are held together by gossip, social pressure, unspoken alliances, and people protecting one another's image. Not everyone has to openly participate for a toxic dynamic to continue. Sometimes silence is enough. Sometimes people simply repeat what they've heard because they don't want to become the next target, and your decision to stop participating changed the entire dynamic. The moment you began setting boundaries, asking questions, protecting your peace, or refusing to follow expectations that felt wrong, the atmosphere changed. People who were comfortable with the old version of you suddenly became uncomfortable with the new one. Why? Because control becomes difficult when someone stops cooperating with it. Imagine a room where everyone has become accustomed to the darkness. Nobody complains because they've forgotten what the room looks like in daylight. Then someone opens the curtains. Suddenly, every detail becomes visible. The light didn't create the mess, it simply removed the ability to pretend it wasn't there. That's what your awareness did. You began noticing who carried information from one person to another. You noticed who acted supportive in public but behaved differently in private. You noticed who remained silent when you were being treated unfairly but became loud when there was an opportunity to criticize you. These discoveries can be painful because they force you to reconsider people you once trusted. But sometimes clarity doesn't arrive through a dramatic revelation. Sometimes it arrives through dozens of tiny inconsistencies, finally forming one clear picture. And here's what they didn't understand. You didn't have to fight everyone to recognize the pattern. You simply had to observe. The more you stopped reacting emotionally, the more clearly you could see the dynamics around you. You stopped trying to convince everyone of your intentions. You stopped explaining every decision. You stopped chasing people who had already chosen their version of the story. That silence gave you something powerful: perspective. People who rely on confusion become uncomfortable around someone who is calm enough to observe the situation without immediately reacting. Your public struggle may have been intended to isolate you, but instead it taught you exactly where you needed stronger boundaries. It showed you which connections were genuine and which ones depended on your silence or compliance. And once you understood that, the situation no longer looked the same. You weren't simply dealing with individual disagreements. You were learning how group dynamics can influence people's behavior. You were learning how quickly people can follow a narrative without checking whether it's true. Most importantly, you learned that you don't need to participate in every narrative created about you. Your responsibility is not to control what everyone thinks. Your responsibility is to remain grounded in who you know yourself to be. And that is where your power returned. Number 5. Discernment became the compass that helped you navigate what you couldn't yet explain. People may have called you overly cautious. Some may have said you were reading too much into things. Others may have told you to ignore your instincts. But there were moments when that inner warning proved worth listening to. Discernment isn't about assuming everyone is against you. It's about learning to recognize when words, actions, and intentions don't line up. You became better at noticing those differences because experience taught you to pay attention. You started recognizing the uncomfortable pause before someone answered, the change in someone's tone when another person entered the conversation, the compliment that somehow left you feeling smaller instead of encouraged, the sudden enthusiasm that appeared only when someone needed something from you. These details may look insignificant to someone else, but when you begin recognizing patterns, small details can become important information. Think of a navigator traveling through unfamiliar territory. They don't wait until they are completely lost before checking the map. They constantly compare their surroundings with the direction they're supposed to be heading. That's what discernment allows you to do. You pause, you observe, you compare what someone says with what they repeatedly do, and that has protected you more than you probably realize. Maybe there was a relationship that looked perfect from the outside, but consistently left you exhausted. Maybe an opportunity sounded exciting, but came with conditions that would have trapped you. Maybe there were rooms where you could feel that something wasn't right, even though nobody had openly said anything wrong. Instead of ignoring those signals, you learn to step back. That's growth. Your instincts don't have to make you fearful. They can simply make you more intentional. You don't have to assume the worst about everyone. You just stop giving everyone automatic access to your trust, and that difference matters. The people who expected you to react impulsively may have been surprised by your restraint. They may have expected an argument, an emotional response, or some dramatic confrontation. Instead, you became quieter and more observant. You started choosing your moves carefully. That's why discernment can feel so powerful. It doesn't always tell you exactly what is happening. Sometimes it simply tells you, pay attention. And sometimes that is enough. You don't need to know every detail before creating distance from something that repeatedly feels unhealthy. You don't need a courtroom full of evidence before deciding that a certain relationship isn't good for you. You can observe the pattern and make a wise decision. That's why you're still standing. Not because you predicted everything perfectly, but because you learned to listen when something inside you told you to pause. Number 6. They challenged you because your integrity didn't match the story they wanted to tell about you. They weren't always trying to understand your character. Sometimes they were looking for a reaction they could use as evidence against you. They pushed certain boundaries. They questioned your intentions. They provoked you. They waited to see whether pressure would make you become someone you weren't. But they underestimated what you had already learned through your journey. You had discovered that strength doesn't always look aggressive. Sometimes strength is remaining calm when someone is desperately trying to make you react. Sometimes it is walking away without needing the final word. Sometimes it is refusing to become cruel simply because someone treated you badly. Your life became evidence that pain doesn't have to turn a person bitter. You could experience betrayal and still choose honesty. You could experience rejection and still remain kind. You could be disappointed without becoming destructive. You could protect yourself without losing your humanity. And that can be confronting to people who expected pain to change you into someone easier to criticize. Think about an original piece of art beside a cheap imitation. From far away, they may appear similar, but the closer you look, the differences become obvious. Your consistency became that closer look. You weren't trying to prove anything. You simply kept making choices that reflected your values. Over time, those choices became stronger evidence than anything anyone could say about you. So when they questioned you, you didn't need to perform perfection. You simply needed to remain authentic. They may have wanted you to lose your temper so they could point at your reaction. They may have wanted you to become bitter so they could say, "See, we were right." They may have wanted you to abandon your principles because it would make their behavior easier to justify. But you didn't give them that ending. You learned to respond instead of react. You learned that not every accusation deserves an answer. You learned that protecting your character sometimes means refusing to enter a situation designed to compromise it. And that's when the pressure began producing the opposite result from what they expected. Instead of breaking your identity, it clarified it. Instead of making you desperate for approval, it taught you independence. Instead of making you chase every person who walked away, it taught you to recognize the value of your own peace. They wanted to know whether your strength was real. Your consistency answered the question. You didn't have to defeat anyone. You simply had to remain yourself. And sometimes that is the most powerful response of all. You stood with your dignity intact, even after everything they tried to take from you. That's when they realized you couldn't be bought, controlled, or turned into someone you weren't. You weren't too sensitive or too deep. You were simply too real for their illusions. Number 7. When their hidden tactics failed, they created noise. At first, they worked quietly. Whispers, subtle sabotage, and situations designed to make you disappear on your own. But you noticed the patterns. You adjusted, stayed calm, and kept moving forward. When they couldn't break you privately, they made everything louder. They exaggerated your mistakes, twisted stories, and tried to turn public attention against you. But their obsession eventually exposed itself. The more they talked about you, the more people could see how much energy they were spending trying to bring you down. You didn't need to fight every accusation. You stayed composed and let time reveal what arguments couldn't. Their attempt to shame you became evidence of their own behavior. Number 8. They tried to drown you in shame, but you learned how to breathe through it. They wanted you replaying their words, doubting yourself, and fighting your own reflection. But instead of staying trapped in that cycle, you learned from it. The manipulation, guilt, and twisted conversations became lessons. What once triggered you eventually taught you emotional control. You learned to recognize unhealthy patterns before they could pull you in. They expected shame to make you weaker. Instead, it made you wiser. You don't panic at every difficult situation anymore because you've already survived deeper waters. Number 9. They called it love and loyalty, but sometimes it was really control. Not every "I love you" comes from genuine love. Sometimes affection is used to lower your boundaries. They called it loyalty, but expected obedience. They called it protection, but demanded control. They called it family, but made you feel trapped. You eventually noticed the pattern. Favors came with conditions, support came with expectations, and love seemed to require your silence. Your discernment helped you recognize the difference between genuine care and emotional control. And once you saw it clearly, you stopped confusing a cage for a home. They tried to limit your potential, but you woke up before you lost yourself. Once you recognize that control isn't love, you stop confusing captivity with care. The truth may have hurt, but it also freed you. You stopped giving away your power just to keep someone else comfortable. You stopped calling manipulation devotion, and you stopped sacrificing yourself in the name of loyalty. What was meant to weaken your spirit ultimately made you wiser, more aware, and harder to control. Number 10. Your spirit became the mirror they didn't want to face. They didn't dislike you because of everything you did. Sometimes your presence simply revealed things they didn't want to acknowledge about themselves. You didn't have to expose anyone. Your honesty, your boundaries, and the way you carried yourself were enough to make certain contradictions visible. For a long time, people can hide behind excuses, appearances, and carefully constructed images. Then someone enters the room who refuses to play along, and suddenly those hidden cracks become obvious. Your truth didn't create their discomfort, it revealed it. Imagine someone looking into a mirror and becoming angry with the reflection. Instead of changing what they see, they blame the mirror. That's what happens when people attack the person who exposes a truth they aren't ready to face. They may have tried to twist your words, question your character, or make you doubt yourself. But their reaction was never proof that you were wrong. Sometimes it was simply proof that your presence challenged an illusion, and you survived without becoming what hurt you. While they remained trapped in bitterness, you chose growth. While they tried to pull you into their darkness, you kept moving toward clarity. The mirror remains, and so do you. Number 11. What they called bullying became a sign that you didn't belong in their crowd. The laughter, criticism, exclusion, and public embarrassment may have made you feel like an outsider. But sometimes being pushed away from a certain crowd is exactly what forces you to discover your own identity. You were never required to blend into every environment around you. You don't have to become smaller just to make other people comfortable. Most people learn to follow the crowd because belonging feels safe. But your journey may have required something different, learning how to stand alone without losing yourself. What once felt like rejection eventually became separation. You began understanding that not every group deserves access to you, and not every opinion deserves a place in your mind. The humiliation didn't define your future. It taught you resilience. It showed you that you can be misunderstood and still keep moving. You can be excluded and still build a meaningful life. They may have wanted you to feel ashamed of being different. Instead, you learn to value the very qualities that made you different. Number 12, they used labels to question your clarity. When people can't easily challenge your message, sometimes they challenge the person delivering it. They may call you emotional, difficult, paranoid, or unrealistic simply because you notice things they would rather ignore. But a label isn't automatically a fact. Sometimes it's a way of ending a conversation without actually addressing the truth. You began recognizing that pattern. When you noticed inconsistencies, you were told you were imagining things. When you expressed discomfort, you were called too sensitive. When you questioned something, you were treated like the problem. But instead of allowing those labels to define you, you learned to evaluate yourself honestly. You asked, am I reacting from fear, or am I recognizing a genuine pattern? Am I being unreasonable, or am I finally setting a boundary? That self-awareness became your protection. You didn't need to accept every accusation, and you didn't need to prove yourself to everyone. Your clarity became stronger because you learned to question both yourself and the situation. That's real discernment. Number 13. They mistook your silence for weakness. They saw you staying quiet and assumed you had nothing to say. They saw your restraint and thought you were afraid. They didn't understand that silence can be a deliberate choice. You didn't need to respond to every insult. You didn't need to win every argument. You didn't need to chase every rumor. Sometimes the strongest move is simply stepping back and allowing people's behavior to speak for itself. While they were talking, you were observing. While they were reacting, you were learning. You noticed contradictions, repeated patterns, and changes in behavior. You discovered that truth doesn't always need a loud defense. Sometimes time reveals more than confrontation ever could. Think of a seed beneath the soil. Nothing appears to be happening on the surface, but underneath, something is developing. Your silence was like that. It wasn't surrender, it was preparation. And eventually, reality began speaking for itself. You didn't have to force the truth into the open. You simply stopped interfering with the process. Your silence wasn't defeat, it was control. Number 14, you survived the pattern and now you understand it. This is where everything changes. What you experienced taught you how unhealthy patterns operate. You learned how shame can be used to control people. You learned how guilt can disguise itself as love. You learned how loyalty can be demanded instead of earned. You saw how confusion can keep someone trapped and how self-doubt can become a prison. But you didn't stay there. You recognized the pattern and began stepping outside of it. Your scars became lessons, your difficult experiences became wisdom. The things that once confused you now help you recognize warning signs much earlier. Imagine escaping a maze and then realizing you now know where every dead end is. You don't have to enter the same paths again. That's what experience gives you. You don't need revenge. You don't need to destroy anyone. You simply need to refuse to repeat what nearly destroyed your peace. What was meant to make you powerless taught you boundaries. What was meant to shame you taught you self-respect. What was meant to silence you taught you the value of your own voice. Chosen one, you didn't just survive a painful chapter, you learned from it. And that knowledge changes how you walk into every chapter that comes next. Their opinions don't define you, their labels don't define you, their rejection doesn't define you. Your character, your choices, your growth, and the person you become after everything you've endured, that is your real answer. What was meant to break you became part of your strength. What was meant to hide you revealed your resilience. And what once looked like the end became the beginning of a wiser version of you. You survived. You learned. You awakened. And now you move forward with clarity they can no longer take away. If this message speaks to your journey, like this video, subscribe, and remember, you don't have to become bitter because you were hurt. You can become wiser because you survived.